We're making an emergency landing! Captain Melissa Grant's voice crackled through Flight 729 as both engines died at 31,000 feet, leaving 147 passengers gliding towards certain death, until a 71-year-old retired colonel in seat 14C quietly stood up and changed everything. Hi everyone, welcome to Unveiled Narratives. The first indication something was wrong came at 2:47 p.m., 31,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. Captain Melissa Grant felt it before she heard it, a subtle vibration through the yoke, followed by the unmistakable whine of Engine 1 winding down. The Boeing 737's cockpit suddenly filled with amber warning lights, each one screaming a different catastrophe. Engine failure, number 1. First Officer Jason Lee called out, his hands already dancing across the overhead panel. At 28, Jason had logged enough simulator hours to handle single-engine emergencies in his sleep. But this wasn't the simulator. Melissa's 12 years of experience kicked in like muscle memory. "Engine 1 shutdown checklist," she commanded, her voice steady despite the growing pit in her stomach. She'd practiced this scenario hundreds of times. One engine down wasn't catastrophic. The 737 could fly perfectly well on one. Then Engine 2 began its death spiral. "Jesus Christ," Jason whispered, watching his instruments cascade into red. We're losing Engine 2. The vibrations stopped. The cockpit fell eerily quiet except for the whistle of wind over aluminum and the increasingly frantic chimes of warning systems. Melissa felt her stomach drop as the aircraft began its inevitable descent. No engines, no thrust. They had become a very expensive, very heavy glider, carrying 147 souls. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Melissa transmitted, her training overriding the terror clawing at her chest. "Denver Center, United 729, dual engine failure, declaring emergency. We need immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." Behind them, in the passenger cabin, the reality was starting to sink in. Flight attendant Sarah Chen moved through the aisles with practiced calm, but passengers weren't fooled. The sudden silence where jet noise should be, the subtle but noticeable descent. Something was very wrong. In seat 22A, 6-year-old Emma pressed her face to the window, watching mountains grow larger. "Mommy, why did the airplane get so quiet?" Rachel Martinez squeezed her daughter's hand, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Emma had been so excited about her first flight, chattering non-stop about clouds and birds. Now Rachel could only think about how she'd promised Emma's father this trip would be safe. 14 rows forward, Colonel Douglas Kane sat perfectly still in 14C, his weathered hands folded in his lap. At 71, Douglas had spent more time in cockpits than most pilots, 30 years as an Air Force test pilot, including classified programs that didn't officially exist. His trained ear had caught the engine failures before the captain announced anything. Now, listening to the aircraft's systems, he was calculating glide ratios and emergency options. The math wasn't good. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Grant." Melissa's voice came over the intercom, carefully controlled. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties and we'll be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and listen to your flight attendants." Douglas unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Sir, you need to remain seated," Sarah Chen said, intercepting him in the aisle. "I need to speak with your captain," Douglas said quietly. "I'm Colonel Douglas Kane, Air Force retired. I think I can help." Sarah studied his face, the calm gray eyes, the bearing that spoke of command. Something in his voice made her decision. "Follow me." In the cockpit, Melissa and Jason were running out of options. Denver International was too far. Colorado Springs might be reachable, but barely. Every second of gliding was precious altitude they couldn't get back. Captain Grant? Sarah's voice came from behind them. There's a passenger who says he can help. He's military? Melissa glanced back, saw a silver-haired man in civilian clothes. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but… Summit Ridge Regional, Douglas said without preamble. 30 miles northeast, single runway, 4,000 feet, but it's within glide range. Jason looked up from his charts. 4,000 feet? Captain, we need at least 6,000 for a 737. Under normal circumstances, Douglas agreed. But these aren't normal circumstances. I've put jets down on shorter strips. The runway's carved into a mountain shelf. If we overshoot, we hit rock. But if we don't try it, we'll hit trees anyway in about 15 minutes. Melissa stared at him. You're talking about a dead-stick landing on a runway that's too short? With no margin for error? I'm talking about the only option that keeps your passengers alive, Douglas replied. I can help you do it, but we need to start our approach now. The next 10 minutes passed in a blur of calculations and desperate preparation. Douglas guided them through an approach profile no commercial pilot had ever attempted, a side-slip maneuver that would bleed altitude and airspeed simultaneously, something typically used only in small aircraft. In the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft bank sharply, then straighten, then bank again. Rachel held Emma closer as the little girl began to cry. Around them, grown men and women gripped armrests and whispered prayers. I can see the runway, Jason called out. Jesus, it's tiny. Summit Ridge Regional looked like a postage stamp carved into the mountainside. At the far end, a granite cliff face rose like a wall. If they came in too fast, too high, or too slow, it would all be over. Gear down, Melissa ordered. Gear down, 3 green, Jason confirmed. Airspeed 160, descending through 8,000, Douglas read from over Melissa's shoulder. You're perfect on the approach. Trust your instruments. But instruments couldn't capture the visual horror of rushing toward a runway that seemed to shrink with every second. The mountainside flashed past the windows as Melissa fought to maintain the impossible approach Douglas had outlined. 1,000 feet, Jason called. Airspeed 140, sync rate steady, Douglas added. You've got this, Captain. 500 feet! The runway filled their windscreen. Melissa could see every crack in the asphalt, could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves along the sides. 50 feet! 30! 20! The Boeing 737 slammed into the runway with a bone-jarring impact that shattered coffee cups and triggered screams throughout the cabin. Melissa stood on the brakes, felt them grab, then fade as the overheated components began to fail. Brakes are going! She shouted. They were still doing 90 miles per hour, and the end of the runway was rushing toward them. The granite cliff face loomed larger, closer. Douglas reached across and yanked the emergency brake handle. The aircraft lurched as the backup system engaged, throwing passengers forward against their restraints. Metal groaned, tires screamed. The cliff face rushed closer, and they stopped. 50 feet from the mountain, 50 feet from oblivion. For a moment, the cockpit was silent except for cooling metal and the distant sound of sirens. Then Melissa began to shake. We did it, she whispered. We actually did it. Behind them, the passenger cabin erupted in applause and tears. Emma looked up at her mother with wide eyes. Mommy, why is everyone crying? Because we're safe, baby, Rachel sobbed. We're safe. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft. Passengers evacuated down the slides with remarkable calm, many stopping to shake hands with the crew, to hug flight attendants, to simply touch solid ground and weep. Douglas was among the last to leave. As he walked down the aisle, passengers reached out to touch his arm, sensing somehow that this calm stranger had played a role in their survival. At the bottom of the evacuation slide, a crowd of first responders and family members had gathered. Douglas scanned the faces, looking for Dad? Commander Landon Kane stood 50 feet away in his Air Force dress blues, his face a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been hope. At 45, Landon carried the same steady bearing as his father, the same gray eyes. But those eyes held 5 years of pain. 5 years of silence that had followed their last terrible argument. Douglas walked toward his son, each step closing not just physical distance, but years of stubborn pride and wounded feelings. When they were arm's length apart, both men stopped. "I heard the news," Landon said quietly. "When they said Colonel Douglas Kane was aboard, His voice cracked. "I'm sorry," Douglas said. "About everything. About what I said. About not—" Landon stepped forward and embraced his father. Around them, cameras flashed and video rolled, capturing the moment that would define the Summit Ridge miracle for the world. Not just as a story of aviation heroism, but as a testament to the power of second chances. The investigation that followed revealed a manufacturing defect so rare it had never been documented. A cascade failure that should have been impossible. The odds of survival, investigators concluded, had been less than 10%. Captain Melissa Grant was hailed as a hero, though she consistently credited Douglas Kane with making the impossible possible. "He gave us hope when we had none," she told reporters. "He showed us that sometimes experience and courage can overcome physics." 6 months later, Douglas stood before a graduating class at the Air Force Academy. In the front row, among the new second lieutenants receiving their wings, sat his grandson, Landon's boy, whom Douglas had never known before that day at Summit Ridge. "Heroism," Douglas told the assembled cadets, "isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and answering the call anyway. It's about using everything you've learned, everything you are, in service of something larger than yourself." As he spoke, his eyes found his grandson's face, saw the pride there, the connection bridging 3 generations of service and sacrifice. "And sometimes," he concluded, "the most important thing you'll ever do won't happen in a planned mission or a textbook scenario. It'll happen on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when everything goes wrong, and someone needs you to remember who you are." The applause that followed wasn't just for his words, but for the living proof that sometimes, against all odds, the impossible becomes inevitable when courage meets opportunity in the thin air above the mountains. Love this story? Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen. You won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.